The village of St. Mary Mead lay beneath a gentle veil of early autumn mist, the sort that softened the edges of hedgerows and made the stone cottages appear almost dreamy in the pale morning light. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and wood fires. In the small sitting room of her neat cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably beside the window with a basket of pale pink wool resting in her lap. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she worked on what appeared to be a rather elaborate baby cardigan. Miss Marple always found knitting a helpful occupation while thinking. Her friend Dolly Bantry was speaking rather animatedly across the tea table. "My dear Jane, you simply must come," Mrs. Bantry insisted, pouring more tea. "The Antiques Exhibition at Rosebridge Manor is the most exciting thing to happen here in years. They've brought pieces from London dealers, family heirlooms, and all sorts of curious things." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Curious things are very often the most revealing, Dolly." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "Oh, you always say that, but this time I mean it. There's a remarkable antique doll, positively eerie if you ask me, found in the attic of the manor only last month." Miss Marple paused her knitting. "Indeed?" "Yes, belonged to the previous owners apparently. A Victorian doll, beautifully preserved. Everyone has been quite taken with it." Miss Marple resumed knitting. "I have noticed," she said gently, "that objects from the past often carry with them more stories than one might expect." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well then, you must come and see it for yourself." Rosebridge Manor stood just beyond the village, its grey stone facade partly hidden behind ancient chestnut trees. It had been recently purchased by Mr. Edwin Harcourt, a retired solicitor from London who had chosen St. Mary Mead for what he called a quieter life among respectable company. The manor had quickly become the centre of village interest. Harcourt himself was a tall, thin man with precise manners and a voice that suggested he had spent many years arguing politely in courtrooms. Though generally agreeable, there was something slightly reserved about him though he guarded parts of his past with deliberate care. On the afternoon of the exhibition, villagers gathered eagerly in the manor's drawing rooms, admiring glass cabinets filled with delicate porcelain, silver snuff boxes, embroidered fans, and antique jewellery. Miss Marple arrived quietly with Mrs. Bantry. Her sharp eyes moved calmly about the room. She noticed people first, objects second. A young woman stood beside one display case, nervously adjusting a row of lace gloves. This was Clara Harcourt, Edwin Harcourt's niece, who had come to live with him earlier that year. She was pale and pretty, with an anxious expression that rarely left her face. Near the fireplace stood Dr. Leonard Graves, the village physician, a thoughtful man in his 40s. He spoke softly to guests, while occasionally casting concerned glances toward Clara. At another table, examining a silver brooch with intense interest, was Mrs. Augusta Pembroke, a wealthy widow who had once lived at Rosebridge Manor decades earlier before selling the estate. She seemed distinctly displeased to see certain items, displayed family possessions, she muttered, to anyone who would listen, sold in haste, and now paraded about like curiosities. Meanwhile, a tall young man with dark hair stood near the window studying a catalogue. This was Thomas Elwood, a local schoolteacher, known for his quiet intelligence and fondness for village history. Miss Marple observed all of them with interest. Human nature, she believed, was much like knitting patterns. Once you understood the structure, everything else followed. The doll, the centerpiece of the exhibition, stood inside a glass case near the staircase. Guests gathered around it in fascinated whispers. It was indeed a remarkable object. A doll stood nearly 2 feet tall, dressed in a delicate cream lace gown trimmed with faded blue ribbons. Its porcelain face was beautifully painted, with soft pink cheeks and wide glass eyes that reflected the lamplight, yet something about it felt strangely lifelike. Miss Marple examined it closely. "Victorian," said Mr. Harcourt, appearing beside her, "circa 1880, according to the dealer who helped catalogue our collection." "Quite charming," Miss Marple said, "and rather valuable," Harcourt added. Mrs. Bantry shivered theatrically. "I don't like its eyes." "Oh, nonsense," said Harcourt, with a polite smile. But Miss Marple had noticed something else. A small seam in the doll's bodice appeared slightly loose, as though it had once been open. Tea was served in the conservatory. Miss Marple sat with Dr. Graves and Thomas Elwood while Mrs. Bantry circulated enthusiastically. "I hear the doll was discovered in the attic," said Miss Marple conversationally. "Yes," said Elwood. "Clara found it while sorting old trunks." Clara, seated nearby, looked uncomfortable. "It was wrapped in cloth," she said quietly. "Quite forgotten." "Most interesting," Miss Marple murmured. Dr. Graves leaned forward. "Mr. Harcourt intends to sell some items at auction later this year. The exhibition helps determine interest." Clara looked sharply at her uncle across the room. "He shouldn't," she said softly. Miss Marple noticed an uneasy past later that afternoon. Mrs. Pembroke cornered Miss Marple near the staircase. "You're Miss Marple?" "I believe yes. I lived here once," Mrs. Pembroke said stiffly, "before Harcourt bought the place. Indeed, my late husband sold it. Financial difficulties." Her gaze drifted toward the doll's case. "That doll belonged to the daughter of the original family. The child died rather tragically, if I recall." Miss Marple tilted her head. "How sad." Mrs. Pembroke lowered her voice. "There were whispers even then. Whispers about secrets hidden in the house." Miss Marple said nothing, but she noticed Clara watching them anxiously from across the room. A small accident as evening approached. Guests began to depart. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows. Miss Marple was just retrieving her gloves when a sudden noise echoed from the main hall. A crash. Then a cry. Several people hurried toward the staircase. Miss Marple followed at a slower pace. At the bottom of the stairs lay Mr. Edwin Harcourt. He was sprawled awkwardly on the stone floor, his glasses shattered beside him. Clara rushed forward. "Uncle Edwin." Dr. Graves knelt beside the fallen man. The room fell silent. After a moment, the doctor stood slowly. "I'm afraid Mr. Harcourt is dead." A murmur swept the gathering. Mrs. Bantry gasped. "But he only slipped." Dr. Graves looked troubled. "Yes, it appears to be a fall." Miss Marple's gaze drifted upward. The staircase railing. The steps. Then quite calmly to the glass case nearby. The antique doll still stood inside, but its bodice seam had opened slightly, as though something inside had shifted. Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. "It is curious," she murmured. "Very curious indeed. For in villages like St. Mary Mead, accidents were sometimes nothing of the sort, and somewhere within that antique doll, a forgotten photograph was waiting to be discovered." The rain continued steadily through the evening, pattering against the tall windows of Rosebridge Manor as the remaining guests gathered in uneasy silence within the drawing room. The sudden death of Mr. Edwin Harcourt had transformed what had begun as a pleasant village exhibition into something far darker. Near the fireplace, Miss Jane Marple sat quietly with her hands folded over her knitting bag. Her pale blue eyes moved thoughtfully from one face to another. Across the room, Dolly Bantry whispered anxiously with several neighbors. "It was simply dreadful," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "One moment he was speaking with the vicar, and the next well down the staircase he went." "Accidents happen," someone replied uneasily. Miss Marple said nothing. In her experience, accidents often occurred precisely when they were most convenient. The doctor's doubts deep. Leonard Graves stood near the window speaking in a low voice with the village constable, Sergeant Miller, who had arrived not long after the incident. "It appears to be a fall," the doctor was saying carefully, "but something troubles me." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "Yes, Harcourt was in excellent health. No dizziness, no heart trouble. A simple slip is possible, of course, but—" Dr. Graves lowered his voice. "The position of the body was unusual." Miss Marple, though seated several feet away, heard every word. Clara Harcourt, meanwhile. Clara Harcourt sat on a small sofa with trembling hands clasped in her lap. Her eyes were red from crying. Miss Marple approached gently. "My dear child, may I sit with you?" Clara nodded gratefully. "It's so dreadful," she whispered. "Uncle Edwin was perfectly well. Indeed, he never rushed downstairs either. He was always careful." Miss Marple considered this. Was he expecting someone this evening? Clara hesitated. I don't believe so." Miss Marple noticed the hesitation, a small detail, but small details often proved most revealing. The doll revisited. While the constable spoke with Dr. Graves, Miss Marple wandered slowly back toward the hall. The glass case containing the antique doll remained where it had been placed earlier. However, the room was now empty. Miss Marple leaned closer. "Yes." The seam in the doll's bodice had opened slightly further, almost imperceptibly. Curious thing, most collectors preserved antiques with extreme care, yet this seam appeared to have been deliberately stitched, and recently loosened. Miss Marple glanced around. No one was watching. With the smallest movement of her knitting needle, she gently lifted the fabric. Something thin and square slipped partially into view. Paper. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, but before she could examine it further, footsteps sounded behind her. Thomas Elwood arrives, Miss Marple. It was Thomas Elwood, the young schoolteacher. He looked pale but composed. Terrible business, isn't it? Yes, indeed, Miss Marple replied mildly. Elwood looked at the doll. Strange thing, that. You think so? Something about it always made Clara uneasy. Did it? Yes, she discovered it in the attic, but after that she seemed reluctant to keep it. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. How curious. Elwood adjusted his spectacles. I suppose it reminded her of childhood tragedies. The doll belonged to a girl who died here long ago. Miss Marple remembered Mrs. Pembroke mentioning the same story earlier. Such histories often linger, she said gently. Mrs. Displeasure in the drawing room. Mrs. Augusta Pembroke had recovered her composure and was speaking sharply to the constable. I see no reason to delay our departure, she insisted. Mr. Harcourt clearly slipped. Sergeant Miller shook his head. I'm afraid everyone present will need to remain until we take statements. Mrs. Pembroke sniffed. Very inconvenient. Miss Marple noticed the woman's irritation was directed less at the delay and more at something else entirely. Her gaze repeatedly drifted toward the hall. The doll, a curious discovery later that evening, once the initial statements had been taken and the body removed. Most of the guests prepared to leave. Miss Marple, however, lingered. The hall was quiet now. The glass case stood open, left that way during the commotion. Miss Marple gently lifted the doll. It was heavier than expected. Carefully, she opened the loosened seam. Inside, she found a small folded photograph. Miss Marple unfolded it. Slowly. Her eyes sharpened at once. The photograph showed two people standing beside the fountain in Rosebridge Manor's garden. One was unmistakably Edwin Harcourt, the other a young woman, but not Clara. Miss Marple studied the image closely. There was something strikingly familiar about the woman's face, yet she could not immediately place it. On the back of the photograph were 3 words written in faded ink: "Truth will return." Miss Marple folded the photograph again. Well now, she murmured softly, that is interesting. The village web the following morning. St. Mary Mead buzzed with speculation. At the Blue Boar Inn, villagers gathered eagerly. Tragic accident, said one. Or perhaps not, said another. Miss Marple sat near the window with her tea, while Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. Well, Jane, what do you think? Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. It is always dangerous, she said, to assume that events are exactly what they appear. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer. You think someone pushed him? My dear Dolly, I merely think that human nature has a remarkable way of revealing itself when money, secrets, or past grievances are involved. Suspects begin to form as Miss Marple reflected on the previous evening. Several possibilities began arranging themselves neatly in her mind. Clara Harcourt, the nervous niece who might inherit the estate. Dr. Leonard Graves, the physician who had grown very close to Clara in recent months. Thomas Elwood, the schoolteacher, who seemed unusually interested in the manor's history. Mrs. Augusta Pembroke, the former owner whose bitterness toward Harcourt was obvious, and perhaps others still hidden beneath the calm surface of village life. Miss Marple had seen such patterns before. They reminded her very much of a particular case involving a missing church collection box and 3 highly respectable ladies. A disturbing detail later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Rosebridge Manor again. Clara greeted her politely but looked exhausted. I don't know what to do, Clara confessed. Everything feels so strange. Tell me, Miss Marple said gently. Had your uncle any enemies? Clara hesitated. No, none at all. Mrs. Pembroke disliked him for buying the manor, and before that, Clara frowned slightly. I believe Uncle Edwin had once been involved in a legal case many years ago. Something rather unpleasant. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. A legal case, yes, but he never spoke of it. Miss Marple folded her hands. Most interesting. The photograph's secret that evening. Miss Marple studied the photograph again beneath the lamplight. The young woman standing beside Harcourt wore a simple summer dress, but there was something unmistakable in her expression, a quiet determination. Miss Marple suddenly realized where she had seen that face before. Not the woman herself, Someone very like her. A resemblance. Family. Resemblance. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she murmured, very much alike. The photograph was not simply hidden in the doll for sentiment. It had been concealed. Protected. Perhaps even meant to be discovered at the right moment. And if Miss Marple was correct, someone in St. Mary Mead had a past they were desperately hoping would remain forgotten. But before Miss Marple could pursue the matter further, another alarming event would shake Rosebridge Manor, because the antique doll had disappeared. The disappearance of the antique doll was discovered the following morning. Rosebridge Manor, which had only just begun to recover from the shock of Edwin Harcourt's sudden death, was once again thrown into agitation. The doll's glass case stood open and empty. Clara Harcourt stared at it in disbelief. "But it was here last night," she said helplessly. "After everyone left, I remember seeing it." The village constable frowned. No sign of forced entry. Whoever took it likely had access to the house. Standing quietly nearby, Miss Jane Marple observed the room with thoughtful interest. Objects have vanished for many reasons, but when something disappeared immediately after a suspicious death, it was rarely coincidence. The missing doll. Sergeant Miller questioned the household staff first, though there were very few. Only Mrs. Baines, the cook-housekeeper, and a young gardener named Alfred lived on the property. Neither had noticed anything unusual. "The doll," Mrs. Baines said nervously. "Oh yes, everyone talked about it, but I've never touched the thing. Creepy little object if you ask me." The constable nodded. "Anyone else have reason to remove it?" Clara looked confused. Why would anyone want it? Miss Marple did not answer because she knew precisely why. Someone had realized what might be hidden inside it. A conversation with Dr. Graves later that morning. Miss Marple walked along the quiet lane toward the village surgery. Dr. Leonard Graves greeted her warmly. "My dear Miss I suspected you might come." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Doctors often possess useful observations." Graves sighed. "I cannot say I am comfortable with the idea that Mr. Harcourt simply slipped." "Nor am I," Miss Marple replied. The doctor leaned against his desk. The angle of the fall was peculiar, almost as though he had been pushed. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Indeed, but without witnesses, it's difficult to prove." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet," she said gently, "someone felt strongly enough to remove the doll afterward." Dr. Graves looked puzzled. "The doll? Yes, it's gone. Quite." The doctor frowned. "Strange." Miss Marple studied his expression carefully, but if he knew anything about the doll's disappearance, he concealed it very well. Mrs. Pembroke's anger. Miss Marple next visited Mrs. Augusta Pembroke, who was staying at the Blue Boar Inn. The wealthy widow received her stiffly. "I suppose the entire village will gossip about this for weeks," she said. "Irritable." Miss Marple settled comfortably into a chair. "Possibly." Mrs. Pembroke glanced sharply at her. "You believe Harcourt was murdered, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Merely believe that people rarely fall downstairs." Immediately after hosting exhibitions, Mrs. Pembroke said nothing for a moment. Then she sighed. "I never liked the man because he purchased your former home. That house belonged to my husband's family for generations. Harcourt bought it cheaply when we were forced to sell." Miss Marple nodded. "Financial trouble can be most distressing." Mrs. Pembroke's gaze hardened. He had no right to it. Miss Marple watched her quietly. "And the doll?" she asked. Mrs. Pembroke's eyes flickered. "What about it?" "It has disappeared." For a brief moment, genuine surprise crossed the woman's face. "Well," she said sharply, "someone must have stolen it." Perhaps. Miss Marple rose slowly. "But the interesting question is why?" Thomas Elwood's schoolhouse stood at the edge of the village green. When Miss Marple arrived, Thomas Elwood was arranging books on a desk. He smiled politely. "Miss Marple, what brings you here?" "Village history," she replied. Elwood brightened at once. "Ah, a favorite subject of mine." Miss Marple examined the shelves. "I understand Rosebridge Manor has a rather complicated past." "Yes, indeed." Elwood pulled a small ledger from a cabinet. "The estate belonged to the Ainsworth family in the late 19th century. A tragic story, I believe." "Very." He turned a page. "Their young daughter died mysteriously in 1883. Miss Marple listened with interest. "An illness, possibly, though there were rumors at the time." "Rumors that the child had witnessed something she shouldn't." Miss Marple's knitting bag rested quietly on her lap. "How fascinating." Elwood shrugged. Village legends grow over time. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. They do. But she was thinking about the photograph hidden inside the doll. The photograph of Edwin Harcourt and the unknown woman, Clara's secret. That evening Miss Marple visited Clara. Again, the young woman looked pale and distracted. I wish Uncle Edwin had never organized that exhibition, she said. Miserably. Miss Marple spoke gently. My dear, there is something I should like to ask. Clara nodded nervously. Did your uncle ever mention a woman connected to Rosebridge Manor many years ago? Clara looked startled. A woman? Yes. Clara hesitated. Once he received a letter. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, and he seemed very upset. I asked who it was from, but he wouldn't say. When was this? About 3 weeks ago. Miss Marple considered this. And the doll? Clara frowned. I never liked it. Why not? It felt as though someone was watching. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Objects rarely watch us, my dear, but people often watched each other very closely. A sudden incident that night. Another alarming event occurred. The gardener Alfred discovered the greenhouse door smashed open. Inside, several heavy flower pots had been overturned, but the most curious detail was what lay on the stone floor, a torn piece of lace. The same delicate lace used in the doll's dress. Sergeant Miller examined it carefully. Looks like someone destroyed the doll. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Oh no. The constable looked puzzled. No, my dear Sergeant, if someone merely wished to destroy it, they would have done so completely. She picked up the lace fragment. But whoever took the doll was searching for something. The hidden connection. Later that evening, Miss Marple studied the photograph again beneath the lamplight. She had compared it with another image she had quietly obtained from the village records. The resemblance was unmistakable. The young woman standing beside Edwin Harcourt in the photograph was almost identical to Clara, but older. Miss Marple tapped the photograph thoughtfully. Yes, she murmured. That explains a great deal. Because if she was correct, the woman in the photograph was not a stranger at all. She was Clara's mother, and if Clara's mother had once known Edwin Harcourt, then the past had returned to Rosebridge Manor in a very dangerous way. Yet, the greatest revelation was still to come, for the photograph was not the only secret hidden in that doll, and someone in the village was growing increasingly desperate enough to kill again. The following morning dawned pale and cold over St. Mary Mead. A thin mist clung to the hedgerows, and the village seemed quieter than usual, as though the recent events at Rosebridge Manor had cast a thoughtful hush over the countryside. Inside her small cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat beside the window with her knitting needles resting idle in her lap. It was a rare occurrence. Miss Marple always knitted when she thought, but today she was not thinking. She had already reached her conclusion. What remained was simply to prove it. Across the tea table, Dolly Bantry leaned forward impatiently. Well, Jane, she demanded, you've been terribly mysterious for 2 days. Surely you've formed some theory about poor Mr. Harcourt. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. My dear Dolly, village life has taught me that human behavior is remarkably predictable. Mrs. Bantry groaned. Oh dear, that means you know something dreadful. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not dreadful exactly, merely inevitable. The photograph, explained Miss Marple, reached into her knitting bag and withdrew the folded photograph. Mrs. Bantry adjusted her spectacles. Who is that woman? That, said Miss Marple calmly, is the key to the entire matter. She laid the photograph on the table. You will notice the resemblance. Mrs. Bantry stared at it. Well, yes, she looks rather like Clara Harcourt. Precisely, but younger. Miss Marple nodded. Double quotes. The woman in the photograph is Clara's mother. Mrs. Bantry gasped. But Harcourt was her uncle. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, my dear Dolly, I do not believe he was a hidden scandal. Miss Marple explained slowly. Many years ago, Edwin Harcourt was involved in a legal case concerning the Ainsworth family, who once owned Rosebridge Manor. Mrs. Bantry listened with growing fascination. The Ainsworths had a daughter who died tragically, but before that tragedy, there was another matter quietly suppressed. Miss Marple tapped the photograph. A young governess who became inconveniently involved with Mr. Harcourt. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You mean yes? Miss Marple nodded. The governess was Clara's mother. The room fell silent. And Harcourt, Mrs. Bantry whispered. He abandoned her, of course. How dreadful. Quite. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. Years later, Clara came to live with him, but she was not truly his niece. Mrs. Bantry gasped. She was his daughter. Miss Marple inclined her head. Exactly. The forgotten photograph. The photograph, Miss Marple continued, must have been hidden in the doll by Clara's mother many years ago. Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. But why? Because she wanted proof. Proof of Harcourt's responsibility. Yes, Miss Marple smiled faintly, and it appears she hid it inside the doll belonging to the Ainsworth child. Mrs. Bantry shook her head. What a strange place. Not really, Miss Marple replied. Children's toys are rarely searched. The real motive. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. So Clara discovered the photograph and killed Harcourt. Miss Marple shook her head. No, but she had motive. Yes, but motive alone is never enough. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. Clara only discovered the photograph when she found the doll in the attic last month. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Then who killed him? Miss Marple smiled. The person who realized the photograph would reveal an even older crime. The Ainsworth child. Miss Marple spoke quietly. The Ainsworth daughter did not simply die of illness. Mrs. Bantry's mouth fell open. You don't mean? Yes. Miss Marple nodded. She saw something. What? Something that would have destroyed her reputation. Mrs. Bantry whispered, someone killed her. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. I believe so. The crucial clue. Miss Marple stood and walked to the window. The photograph shows Harcourt standing beside Clara's mother in the garden fountain. Yes, and the date printed on the corner places it only weeks before the Ainsworth child died. Mrs. Bantry frowned. I don't understand. The child must have witnessed their quarrel about the pregnancy. Exactly. Miss Marple turned slowly, and someone feared the truth would emerge. A visit to Rosebridge Manor later that afternoon. Several villagers gathered in the drawing room of Rosebridge Manor at Sergeant Miller's request. Among them were Clara Harcourt, Dr. Leonard Graves, Thomas Elwood. Mrs. Augusta Pembroke. Miss Marple sat quietly in an armchair while the constable cleared his throat. Miss Marple believes she has something important to tell us. All eyes turned toward her. Miss Marple smiled politely. I fear that events of recent days are not as simple as they appear. The pattern emerges, she began, gently. Mr. Harcourt's fall down the staircase was no accident. Clara gasped softly. Sergeant Miller nodded grimly. We suspected as much, Miss Marple continued. The reason lies in the past history of this house. Mrs. Pembroke stiffened. The past should remain buried sometimes, Miss Marple said calmly. It refuses the trap. Miss Marple placed the photograph on the table. This was hidden inside the antique doll. Everyone leaned forward. Clara stared at it. My mother. Miss Marple nodded kindly. Yes. The room fell silent. Then Miss Marple spoke her final words carefully. The person who removed the doll was searching for this photograph. She looked slowly around the room, and that person feared what it would reveal. A long silence followed. Outside, the wind rustled through the old chestnut trees. Inside Rosebridge Manor, someone in that room knew their secret was about to be exposed, and Miss Marple had just set the final trap. The truth and the killer would be revealed very soon. The drawing room of Rosebridge Manor had never felt so tense. Outside, the wind stirred the tall chestnut trees that lined the gravel drive, their branches scratching softly against the old stone walls. Inside, the lamps glowed warmly, yet the atmosphere was thick with unease. Everyone present sat in rigid silence at the center of the room. Resting upon the small table lay the faded photograph Miss Marple had produced. The eyes of Miss Jane Marple moved quietly from face to face. Clara Harcourt sat pale and trembling. Dr. Leonard Graves stood beside the fireplace, his expression grave. Thomas Elwood watched intently from the window, and Mrs. Augusta Pembroke sat stiffly upright, her lips pressed into a thin line. Sergeant Miller cleared his throat. Perhaps you might explain. Miss Marple inclined her head politely. Certainly. The past returns. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly over her knitting bag. Many years ago, she began gently, a tragic event occurred in this house. The death of the young Ainsworth child. Thomas Elwood nodded quietly. The historical records mention it. Yes, Miss Marple said, but the records do not tell the entire story. Her gaze drifted briefly toward Mrs. Pembroke. At that time, a young governess worked here. Clara's mother. Clara lowered her eyes. Miss Marple continued softly. She became involved with Edwin. Harcourt. A faint murmur rippled through the room. Such situations were, unfortunately, not uncommon in those days, Miss Marple added kindly, but the relationship ended badly. Harcourt abandoned her. Clara's hands tightened in her lap. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Shortly afterward, the Ainsworth child died suddenly. Sergeant Miller frowned. The doctor at the time declared it illness. Yes, Miss Marple said, but children are very observant creatures. The room grew very quiet. What the child saw, Miss Marple spoke slowly. I believe the Ainsworth child witnessed a quarrel between Harcourt and Clara's mother. Mrs. Ban, who had been allowed to attend, gasped softly. About the pregnancy, she whispered. Miss Marple nodded. The child may have threatened to tell her parents. A long silence followed, and someone present that day, Miss Marple continued, panicked. Her gaze moved across the room. Someone who feared scandal above all else. Sergeant Miller leaned forward. You mean someone killed the child? Miss Marple sighed gently. Yes. The photograph's importance. She picked up the photograph. This image shows Harcourt with Clara's mother in the Manor Gardens. Dr. Graves studied it. So, the photograph proves their relationship existed. Miss Marple turned toward Mrs. Pembroke, and someone who knew the truth feared it might expose their role in the child's death. Mrs. Pembroke's face had gone noticeably pale. The true killer, Miss Marple spoke, quietly but firmly. The person who removed the doll was searching for this photograph. Sergeant Miller nodded. That would explain the broken greenhouse. Yes. Miss Marple's voice grew sharper. Photograph threatened to revive a scandal, buried for decades. She paused, and only one person present here had both knowledge of the past and reason to fear its return. All eyes turned slowly toward Mrs. Pembroke. The widow's hands trembled slightly. This is absurd, she said stiffly. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. My dear Mrs. Pembroke, you lived here at the time of the Ainsworth tragedy. The woman said nothing. You were not merely a visitor, Miss Marple continued gently. You were a close friend of Mrs. Ainsworth. Mrs. Pembroke's voice rose. That proves nothing. No, Miss Marple agreed, but the child recognized you during that quarrel. The room seemed to freeze, and when she threatened to tell her parents, Miss Marple said softly, you pushed her down the garden steps. Clara gasped. Thomas Elwood whispered, good heavens. Mrs. Pembroke's composure finally cracked. That child was hysterical, she cried. She would have ruined everything. Sergeant Miller stepped forward slowly, and Mrs. Pembroke's face twisted with bitterness. That coward wrote to me 3 weeks ago. She spat. He said he intended to confess everything. A stunned silence followed. Miss Marple nodded quietly. Yes, Harcourt wished to clear his conscience, and I couldn't allow it. Mrs. Pembroke shouted. My reputation, my life, everything would have been destroyed. She laughed bitterly. So when he turned on the staircase, I pushed him. Clara covered her mouth in horror. Sergeant Miller moved forward firmly. Mrs. Pembroke, I'm afraid you'll have to come with me. The widow collapsed into a chair, suddenly looking very old. The village restores calm. Later that evening, Rosebridge Manor was quiet again. The police carriage had long since departed. Clara sat near the window, still shaken. Dr. Graves spoke gently to her. You've been very brave. Clara looked toward Miss Marple. I never knew any of it. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Your mother tried to protect you. Clara nodded slowly. I think Uncle Edwin wanted to do the right thing at the end. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. I believe he did. Miss Marple's reflection. Later that night, Miss Marple walked slowly along the village lane with Mrs. Bantry. The moon had risen above the hedge, casting silver light over St. Mary Mead. My dear Jane, Mrs. Bantry said breathlessly. I still can't believe it. Murder hidden for 40 years. Miss Marple smiled gently. Human nature rarely changes. Dolly? Mrs. Bantry shook her head. And all because of a doll. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. Not the doll, my dear. She paused thoughtfully. The photograph. Mrs. Bantry laughed nervously. Well, I shall never look at antique toys the same way again. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Nor, I suspect, will the rest of St. Mary Mead. The quiet village slowly returned to its peaceful routines. Tea would again be served in neat cottages. Garden gossip would resume, and somewhere inside her tidy home, Miss Marple would once again sit by the window with her knitting needles, clicking softly, watching, observing. Because in villages like St. Mary Mead, mysteries had a habit of appearing when least expected, and Miss Marple was always ready.